believe we're alive for our Friday afternoon fireside chat without fire. And we wanted to talk. Well, originally we were going to do more about the Order of Morris, but we'll delay that possibly till next week. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the physical sciences and how they've added prestige to all sorts of disciplines and kind of caused everything to be explained according to physical causality. And to kind of get us going, I thought I would read a line from Mary Midgley's book. Is it Midge? How do you pronounce her last name? I just thought about this as I'm saying it out loud.
Oh, that I would say Midgley. So if
Yeah,
we're
okay.
wrong, I'm wrong with you. We can be wrong
Yeah,
together.
I might have got that wrong, but that's how I thought you should say it. Um, so I want to read a little bit from her forward because there's a number of interesting arguments she makes, but this one I think can get us going here. So she's talking about imaginative visions and how they're central to how we understand the world. And then she says, ever since the prestige of physical science soared so high, a variety of doctrines and all sorts of subjects have used scientific imagery to gain the authority which rightly belongs to science proper. Because they sound technical, people receive their symbolic message as literal truth. Moreover, even in ideologies which do build on genuine scientific ideas, the real scientific notions are often not clearly distinguished from extraneous ones. As a result, many of the fairy tales of our age, the myths that actually shape our thoughts and actions, are ones which owe their force to having appeared in scientific dress. She says more, but I'll pause there. I'll give one illustration and I'll let you kind of jump off of it. Um, I've studied a little bit of philosophy, and I've just noticed how often, even in something that deals with non-quantifiable truths like angels or truth or whatever, how many how many philosophy textbooks have quantitative methods like calculations and formulae and all this kind of stuff in order to sort of, I remember reading this in college and thinking, wow, this is so smart to think about free will. There's Oxford or Cambridge changes, all this kind of stuff. And there's formula everywhere in math, and I don't understand any of it, but it must be true. And on reflection, and I don't mean to be too extreme, but upon reflection, I found that the more that these arguments are masked by this scientific apparatus, the less explainable these things truly are, and
Yeah,
the more inscrutable they become to most, unless you yourself are essentially a calculating person.
yeah. You probably at the most extreme, you see versions of this. You see the kind of the atmosphere of scientific, gravity or whatever, come in to justify claims that we know through extremely immediate experience. And this is usually something you see in the journalistic world. You can often see in the journalistic world, science shows, insert claim that everybody knows. Like boys and girls actually are attracted to each other. And now we can show it with hashtag science. And it's like, well, did we need science actually to confirm that, or did we already know that pretty much? Or is science getting at some causal mechanism like pheromones or something, that we don't understand immediately? Um, so yeah, I think in one sense you see this all over the place, even to lend credibility to the most banal claims, but it becomes a much bigger problem um, when it becomes part of the um, yeah, kind of the imaginative space of your sense of how you think about very basic and especially human things. How do things out there work? But then how do I work? And so
Mm,
the application of this method, especially to trying to unveil the causal structures within the human sciences like sociology, anthropology, psychology, etc., the application of this kind of mechanistic scientific picture effectively to those very human sciences is extremely destructive and has been in our understanding of the self, such that what you see in a lot of contemporary grammar about ourselves um, is kind of the explanation of our own behavior, our own act, our own will, the thing we actually experience with some immediacy, as though it's the epiphenomenon of what's really going on underneath the immediacy of what it feels like to be alive. And so, what's the real human being? What's the real explanation of you and your behavior? It's not whatever you're actually experiencing up here on the surface. it's with all these causal mechanisms underneath the surface that you might not be aware of, but science can study them and statistically algorithmize them and show you how they relate to the brain and chemistry and the sorts of physical structures that science studies. And then voila, what do we get? Well, the science of human beings and that sort of thing. And at worst, that gives us an understanding of ourselves where we actually begin to relate to ourselves in a distorted way because the imagination will affect us. And so, for instance, think of the way people talk about and relate to their brain. Like we even say in our language, my brain is tired. Even my children, sometimes I hear them
Hmm.
say something like, my brain is tired, as opposed to, I'm tired. Uh, in the older view, all of those epiphenomenal lower layers are the scaffolding on top of which God has constructed the unified reality that you perceive in its immediacy. This is the real world. That's all an abstraction and a scaffolding. And what science studies, in a sense, that scaffolding. And what we have done is effectively looked at the scaffolding, looked at the structure of the canvas, and said that it's really the painting. Looked at the paint dots on the canvas and said, that's the structure of the paint is what accounts for the picture, in a sense, and that seems,
Hmm.
yeah, to be a
I think
horrible impact on just our self understanding.
I think where you see this from in the lives of most people, it comes down to like marriage or parenting advice. You know,
Mm,
you might be on Instagram or wherever you are, and there's a reel comes and it's like such and such a study says that X, Y, and Z activities help kids have this better outcome, and if you don't do it, there's a 20% decline in some success rate. And you go, oh man, I need to change my parenting based on this newest set of data because whatever I just heard must be true. And I mean, there's two liabilities with that type of thing. Well, there's many actually, two that I want to talk about. One is first, data changes all the time, so it's not a reliable guide to truth. But secondly, data actually doesn't signify truth. It just doesn't function that way. It's just a collection of stuff. People signify truth and give meaning.
mhm.
So I think a lot of times we have this pressure, like as a parent or whatever, to do things kind of like, well, we have to do it scientifically, like education at school. There has to be these outcomes, and there has to be percentages, and so on. And to a degree, I'm not saying you shouldn't rely on good data and research. Research, that's not my point. But I'm saying if you're constantly led by the nose due to the changing data and information that comes down the pipeline, then I think we will, we're just going to find ourselves. We're going to find ourselves always seeking to have the newest and best data and never able to like do the basic functions of life.
Yep.
I think we talked about earlier today, you and I, like how important the wisdom tradition is, because it's not you relying on your own ingenuity, but relying on the accumulation of wisdom and experience of others,
Yep.
and it gives you a bit of a head start.
And
So, and I
having a
think,
sense of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, actually, I'm done. You go.
I was just going to say, just having a sense of, yeah, having a sense of how all of those things apply to me. I think about this like, no matter what's practical out there, think of raising your kids, think of how to preach if you're a pastor, how to do the scriptural disciplines, how to be a godly woman, how to be a godly man. Right now, we're all disoriented from those things. And you go online, and there's 1 million. If I'm trying to get advice for how to be a godly man online, there's a million life hacks. There's 1 million suggestions, all screaming that this is the key, or that this is the key to being a godly woman. And right, it seems like it's much more real to be oriented more fundamentally than that. In such a whereas now it creates this it creates like a choice paralysis in a sense. If you're disoriented and there's 10 million suggestions, there's a paralysis of internal movement. And I think it's very similar and related to that contrast you were just making between data and truth. DC Schindler also makes that contrast in one of his chapters. You're in good company. DC Schindler and Wyatt's
Which book does he and why Graham? So
love and the
people of equal
love and
authority.
yeah, yeah, love and the postmodern predicament in his chapter on truth. Um, he makes this distinction between there's a way in which we kind of approach truth perhaps as an accumulation of data. It's like we
Mm-hmm,
have
mm-hmm.
data. It's almost like bits. Think of bits that are kind of externally related, and it's Mark Studdick and That Hideous Strength, thinking of humans as units and studying And there's a great line in That Hideous Strength. I happen to think humans can't be studied. I remember uh, only got you can only get to know them, something like that. You can't really
Mm-hmm,
study a person,
mm-hmm.
you can only get to know them. But effectively what he points out is that over given the way that we are oriented to the world and exactly the tendencies you're talking about, there's this conflation of truth more or less with kind of collection of big data sets, and then the attempt to sort of smash them together. Whereas truth in the older sense of the mind's participation in reality, notice the sun is dawning on my face as I'm talking about the truth.
Ooh, I
It was
feel
just weird.
illuminated.
I didn't mean for it to anyway. But truth is reaching into the diversity of things and grasping through an act of the intellect, the inner intelligible shape of something. And it's something solider in a way than the data, in a way, what we call the data can be the catalyst for that reaching beneath. But fundamentally, what we're doing is not just smashing together, again, bits more or less externally arranged and saying, see, that's the reality, but reaching, as it were, underneath that material order set of observations and grabbing, and again, in the old world, it would have been the form. You're taking the form of the thing, which is kind of the inner intelligible shape of a thing, to understand what it is. And
Mm-hmm.
those are different those descriptions are quite different, and they connote different sensibilities about what truth is. And I think in the technological age, yeah, truth tends to get reduced to data out there rather than an inner intelligible shape that I am participating in here uh, as it is out there, which is really the old vision of knowledge, the world out there in you.
Segueing to a different kind of topic here on reductionism in Midge's argument, I'm mindful. I'll introduce it in a second here. I'm mindful that there was a sense of reductionism in the ancient world. So the ancient
Yep.
Greek philosophers wanted to reduce everything to a constituent element, let's say, whether that was fire or water or
Yep.
air. Eventually, Parmenides, in his I can't remember the poem's name, but he seems to kind of locate it in being itself.
Yep.
Although he appears to think that being is a material substance, so maybe it's not until Socrates where it starts to click that being is an immaterial thing. But whatever you want to say about that, so there is a sort of reductionism that happens. One of the characteristics, though, of modern scientific explanation is there's another kind of reductionism that takes the complex set of phenomena of the world and tries to reduce it to physical causality. So what it's doing is it's naming a complex thing and calling it simple, which doesn't exactly work. Midgley doesn't quite say what I said, but she says something similar. She says, what the Enlightenment did was to develop its own set of myths, striking pictures whose attraction usually centers on the lure of reduction, the pleasure of claiming that things are much simpler than they seem. This often appears in the bracing form of nothing buttery. Propositions such as a human being is only 5 pounds worth of chemicals, or human action is only external behavior, or consciousness is just the interactions of neurons have the attraction of seeming to make life simpler because they are simple in themselves. The difficulty only comes when we try to work out what they mean and connect them with the rest of the world. Do you think David Bentley Hart would like that sentence?
Yeah, I think because that's exactly right. That in one sense, there is not there's a mental movement within the late antiquity, those antique philosophers you mentioned, toward reduction. And of course, what happens is that what you're reducing to gets more complex. That the simple principle, as it were, gets complexified, and we have to
Right.
argue about, does this account for things? What becomes very clear to most people in that project very very early is that it can't, materiality as such is just intrinsically composite. It cannot be the principle of reduction. It is in fact kind of at the opposite pole as whatever principle it is that we find the unity of things in. And what's interesting in the modern materialist order, of course, is that it becomes the actual principle of reduction and unity in itself. And here you can think of, I mean, she's mentioning at its weirdest, yeah, you get even the such severe materialists like the Churchlands and such that basically say you're not even really conscious, but even neo-Darwinist, Richard Dawkins' neo-Darwinism, which was getting very popular several decades ago. It's much less popular right now, but effectively the idea it is very simple. There is an elegance. There is a kind of elegance to the mind in its simplicity of this gene thing. This gene is really the thing, and everything about you and around you and everything else is epiphenomenal of just one very simple algorithm and mechanism. Or in fact, it's incredibly powerful when you, again, just imaginatively powerful. Um, Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett. I remember reading that, and again, the way in which he gives you a whole universe, I think it's completely incoherent and wrong, but he can give you a whole universe that reduces down to a simple algorithmic principle. And there's a certain, if you don't see what's wrong with it, there's a certain air of explanation that comes along with that. So yeah, I think she's absolutely right. It's just in one sense the conversation then has to be exactly what happened with the pre-Socratics, which is maybe there is a movement of the mind seeking a kind of unity and a principle unity of things somewhere. But all of these candidate explanations, fire, water, Parmenides' notion of being, even Plato's notion of being, aren't particularly good candidates. I mean, arguably, it's not actually until after the Christian period and the discourse that developed there that we get adequate. We can speak about that origin adequately.
What is in Plato's Phaedo? I can't. It's probably Socrates. Yeah, it must be Socrates. He's explaining all these various forms. It says until you get down to what is necessary, and what is the phrase there again? I think it's ti ekenon. What is necessary? What is sufficient? And what is sufficient seems to be the arche of the forms of the
Right.
morphe. So what is that sufficient thing? And it strikes me that you're suggesting that that sufficient thing isn't fire, water, air, or even being in the way that these guys are talking about. So, what is it?
Yeah. Oh, this is one of the things I really
You can
appreciate
just say
about.
God. It's
Yeah, I
fine.
can I can say God. What I will say God.
No, I don't.
One of the things I really like about Bavinck as an intellectual, as a public intellectual, is
Hmm.
when you read his, especially his philosophy of revelation. I teach this in one of our courses, um, because it's really helpful for when he's summarizing almost all of modern learning. And it's Bavinck, reading the anthropologists and the scientists and the historians, and each of them are trying to reduce all the emerging disciplines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to one grammar of discipline. If you
Hmm.
understand psychology, you'll understand how all these other disciplines work. And one thing that Bavinck is able to do is say each of these are grasping one piece of a complex. The created world is composite. It's irreducibly composite. And one of the things that all these traditions are doing, and this goes back to the pre-Socratics, is trying to find the principle of unity within the world itself. But the world as you experience it is irreducibly composite, and its unity is found outside of it. Its unity is in the mind of God, in the project of God, and in the unity of being that God donates to the created order through His mind and His will. But the idea, nevertheless, is that you don't find the principle of unity in the created order itself, because to do so would be to reject, in a sense, the goodness of being a creature, which is to have that unity splayed across the panorama of the canvas of a diversified life, and have more interesting forms of order, basically. But that's a long-winded way of saying I think, yeah, the unity is in God, and it's saying that isn't cheap. It's also to say the unity is, oh yeah, the drama of the question of being by Ferdinand Ulrich. Uh, 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 Books that are impossible. I'll take books that are impossible to read for 800. Uh,
It's okay. I mean, it's not. it's actually not. It's in anyways.
So it's C.C. Schindler has a companion volume to it actually as well. And for those who are having a hard time dipping their toe in the water of Homo abyssus.
It's actually because he's a bad writer. I mean, I know it's translation, but he's actually not a great writer. And everyone will be
No,
mad that I say that, but it's like he's very much a genius, and there's so much, but he's not a great communicator.
no, kind of like Heidegger.
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe Heidegger is a good writer. What do I know? But most people have a hard time reading him and understanding him. And
right.
that's my he feels he's one of those Catholics that reads Hegel and Heidegger.
Yeah, and someone will have read, Ulrich for like a million hours, and it's like he's really easy to understand. And I think the illustration is just pick up C.S. Lewis and put it next to him. And I know they're doing different things. This is actually it's good. I'm not trying to bash. I'm just saying it's not.
No.
It's hard to understand because he's a bad communicator. Even though it's profound and good, you should still read it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's the same thing with the other volume that is very significant along those lines, and along these lines actually is the recent Analogia Entis by Chavara that was translated by Hart and Betts. But it's also similarly just a very
Oh, the Prisbar. Yeah, I have that too. Analogia Entis.
difficult book to read as well. But they're these. Yeah, a lot of what we're talking about is related to that. But yeah, I mean, I think the answer to what you said earlier is right. It's God, but it's also not creation, and I think that's an interesting thing to say as well.
Because of Cornelius Van Til.
I did, yeah. I wouldn't.
The creator-creature distinction, the antithesis. We're going hard on that right now. So Midgley also brings up this assumption of the omnicompetence of science. And when it limited itself to things appropriate to its discipline, highly successful. You want to measure water for an irrigation system? Highly successful. Like, that's what it's for. But then she makes the point that this success success, however, naturally led theorists in other fields to copy details of their methods in the hope of getting the same results. Their imitations reduced a special kind of fairy tale whose scientific language and details seemed to supply the magic that was needed to subvert traditional views on the ordinary life. Thus, once it was declared that the brain was just a computer made of meat and houses were only machines for living in, everything began to look different. It's an imaginative effect that creates its own symbol, she goes on to explain. So if home was not just the structure around you,
Yep.
That changes things. And the other example she gives was the brain. Now, this is actually really important. So let's go to the house thing for a second. If home is not a place with a feeling and a structure that is beyond space and time, then you might as well every 2 years move from a different cubicle in a tower somewhere and have adequate space and not worry about the meaning of anything and attaching significance to place. But if there is significance to place, then home is more than, transitioning from cubicle to cubicle in a high-rise
Yep.
Dystopian city.
And that, yeah, and what that brings out, and this is, Midgley is using the phrase myth, is the question of whether meaning, in a sense, meaning structures are prior to their material representations, or whether material representations are simply, blank things to have meaning projected into them. And homes are meaning is prior to the arrangement of matter in the making of a home.
Yep.
And
Home
you
is where the
see it
heart is.
Yeah, exactly. But there's ways in which we're already we almost have a hard time imagining how deep that sensibility is for human beings, because we're disconnected from play. Even if we're homeowners in America or Canada or in the West, we're still we're disconnected from place in a way that very few people would have been. So to think like we have one of my students in Davenant lives somewhere in Africa, and they were talking to me about funeral rites and these sorts of things in Africa and the various pieces, and the idea that like you'd be buried from the same piece of land that you came from, the idea that your food comes from the same piece of land that you were kind of birthed out of, like the same area you were birthed in, and you're taking literally the ground inside of you through local food. You're putting that back in through human waste. The sense of ecological extension. Adam was made out of the dirt of the ground. The sense of like the trees and the dirt around here are literally in my body is a very human sensation that we don't really have because even for modern homeowners, we're still within just a couple generations, almost all somewhat migratory
Well,
compared
it's
to
also
that.
connected to the difference between, let's say, work and vocation. So if you built a horseshoe for the horse that you see that moves the grain from the granary down the road,
Yes.
your work is connected to the land, your food's connected to the land.
Yeah.
Home and place have a meaning structure that is beyond, like I think if you go to a lot of like cities where I grew up already, because of how fast modern society transforms, it won't even feel like nostalgia anymore. It's gone. Like if you live in Toronto in 1990 and then you go back in 2025, likely where you grow up is completely transformed and the prior look and feel is gone.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because the function of modern cities is to build, replace, redo. The other analogy or thing she points to is the idea of brain
Yeah.
being just meat, or we're just kind of calculators or whatever. And yeah, there's a real sense in which, like as a Christian, simply put, if you're going to read the Bible and it talks about your renewing your mind or whatever, set your mind on these things, Paul is not referring to the brain as an organ.
Right.
He's
Right.
referring to this rich inner life that we experience that he and other Greeks called the nous, the mind, that is not co-equal to brain, although inclusive of brain, I would say.
Yeah, that's the real this is the that particular uh frontier is I think exactly where the rubber hits the road on this question for the most. A lot of people, partially because they've made kind of a Cartesian distinction between mind and brain, or soul and body. Sometimes there's a disturbing people. Christians can get disturbed about some of the results of neuroscience. I've seen some. I've known two or three folks who've quote unquote lost their faith because they got into neuroscience and realized, oh, look at religious experiences light this up on the brain, or look at this experiment, maybe we don't have free will, and a lot of things that feel most interior, the richest interior experiences, there are things going on in the brain when you have those experiences. And so even if let's if you steel manned it and said, let's say every internal experience in this life has some neural event correlate of electrical firing in the brain. um, Lewis in Miracles has an absolutely, I think he says more about neuroscience in 2 pages than anybody else does in 200, which is typical Lewis. He's usually just helpful and clear. He just makes the point that in no part of the Christian tradition would that have ever been seen as a problem. It's only the Cartesian tradition within which something happening inside of me corresponding to something happening in my body, that's a crisis because Descartes, if at least on the one popular version of Descartes, separated those causal spheres quite deeply. Whereas if the material order is a manifestation of the formal order, then events in the mind in the formal order are conditioned by and expressed in the apparatus of the body and the brain. And that means neural correlates, maybe thorough neural correlates. And on the one way to say this, and I think we really can say this with confidence, is that if if you took any ancient philosopher up until the medieval period and stuck them in a time machine and showed them all the results of modern neuroscience, I think they would look at you and say, "Who cares? Like, why is that a big deal?"
Yeah.
Somehow to us, we're framing the issue as though it's a major, major deal, and it's one of those things that if you think this is getting rid of an internal causal agency, you're missing. That is actually the disease. That is the scientific disease. Is that your imagination is playing some causal zero sum game that is harmful. It's
Yeah.
harmful to your experience of and to your reading of the world.
No, I think so. And there's an interesting you're kind of alluding maybe to parts of it, but there's also a question of truth here. So Midgley says, because symbols were not distinguished from literal truth here,
Hmm.
a general impression has got abroad that literal truth, is the only form of truth. That symbols are some kind of optional extra, and that literal truth is only found in the physical sciences.
Hmm.
So there's this sort of she goes on to talk mechanistic materialism, etc. But like, there's a sense in which if you can't define, quantify, measure, extrapolate, and present in a table or whatever else, then the thing isn't true. And it's interesting to me, someone who studied biblical studies, how when you learn grammar, and much of this is just good pedagogy, I'm not against it, but you often will learn a lot of tabulation, or you'll learn how to diagram sentences, or you'll do like discourse analysis where you're trying to produce results from a stable set of rules on the basis of morphological, syntactical, and rhetorical and discourse patterns. And when you do that, you get to a closer understanding of the text's meaning. But one thing that I have found, I did this for, whatever, 2 decades or so, is at the end of the day, sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes they'll be reading, like, one of the things that really helped me with this was, I read a lot of the, like, or I will read often like church fathers who knew Greek, and you'll just be reading, and they'll have an interpretation of Paul or the New Testament. You'll be like, "Oh, that's odd," and then you'll go back to the text and you go, "Oh, that actually kind of makes a lot of sense," but it doesn't actually fit with my scientific criteria of grammatical, syntactical, rhetorical, and discourse-related argumentation. And then you go, "So, oh, Chrysostom must be incompetent because he didn't have the tools I had," right? Like, that's one option.
Yeah.
Or you go, or have I created a symbolic universe that I believe is literal because the literal interpretation has produced literal results, or has the literal interpretation actually been a sort of untethered allegory that created a sort of myth of stable, straightforward historical meaning, and the result is actually just a number crunching calculation, and
Yeah.
I'm the one who's actually been deceived by my scientific story. And Chrysostom, who says something that seems weird upon second glance, is maybe the one reading literally because he knows Greek, but he's
Yep.
not tied down to the necessity of a historical, literal, scientific apparatus.
Yeah. That's fascinating. What's lost in the plethora of things you described, quantification and that sort of thing, results, efficiency. What's lost there is the human. It's precisely the human, and a person cannot be measured and studied in this way. I mean, genuinely, that's not just a thing to say. There's something about the person that is irreducible to that kind of analysis, and of course, God ultimately is even more cosmically irreducible to that kind of gaze. And what it does is reverses, and this is where that recent Bentley Hart book that we've mentioned a couple times already on the podcast is very good. Is that it really helps you see that the uh, meaning meaning structures have to be prior to this material order, or you just cannot understand reality. And again, uh, 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 yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying we've reversed that. We've lost the person, and it would be interesting to make an argument that it also makes us lose exegesis, because you don't you again approach the text like uh, the best exegetes to me are those who get into the mind of the author in such a way that they can reach below and pull it out and say, this is what the argument is. And you read it and you read the text and you're like, that is
Yeah,
what the
yeah,
argument is.
yeah, yeah. That's right.
That,
So
that, there's an art to that kind. All the tools you just mentioned are helps. But one of the things, when exegesis is simply pure kind of philological math, every now and again, that kind of not every now and again, sometimes that does win the day. This means that, well, it can't, because in this year, when you add the preposition to the this, sometimes philology wins the day very directly.
yeah, oh, for
Most
sure.
of
If
the,
it's like, what
most
is
of
a
the,
boat?
yeah, I mean, most of the time, though, the reason I think about this is often because of I cut my teeth like many theological young people in the '90s. on the Calvinist Arminian debate, right? And so you read all the books about for Calvinism, against Calvinism, and they're all
Some people
debating.
think God chooses you, and other
Yeah,
people think we choose God.
yeah, and
That's the only
they're all
difference.
debating the same passages. They're
Yeah.
all very well trained in Greek and Hebrew, and you get high class scholars looking at exactly the same text, exactly the same arguments. And you look at it over 200 years of publishing, you're like, the arguments haven't changed. The competency of the arguments are exactly the same. And perhaps the problem is it's not just exegetical math that's
It's
going
not just
to
exegetical math.
that actually is making the full interpretation. And really, uh, maybe it makes you realize a lot of these disputes are post exegetical. they're they're
Or
not
pre.
they're not immediately what's going on in the text, and yet the questions we ask go on for us and they matter, and you're applying what's going on in the text to a question it's not directly asking.
Well, I think a lot of the doctrine of God discussions that happen currently are similar to this. So, if the subject of the Bible is God, and God is, by definition, infinite, and then you apply finite methodology to describe, name, and articulate infinite being, you can see that there's, in the method itself, the inability to describe what the method aims to achieve.
Right.
So, usually a scientific method achieves to have some sort of assured results based on
Yep.
a set methodology and criteria. But if you're going to measure, God, does he change more times than does he say he doesn't change? And you say, well, 82% of the time God changes. 18% of the time God doesn't change.
Yep.
On the balance of probabilities, God is changeable. Well, but that does see that's a quantitative method that doesn't actually work. And so, anyways, there's just different things happening there that I think are important. So I think sometimes it's pre-exegetical, but then post-exegetical too, where your post-exegetical reflection on the text sometimes has to do more with your sensibilities than it has to do with, the straightforwardness of the text. So there's a ton of conversations happening. But I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I found really important, because I think you can come to truth and understand it, is, first of all, sometimes you can't always know the quantification. So if you're like, how many precise years were there between Genesis 6 and Genesis 39? I think you can know truth, but you may not be able to count those years. You know what I mean? Like, so there's
Yep.
categories. But if you can know, so there's that kind of thing. But did Jesus rise from the dead? Yes, there's different kinds. One of the things that's been really helpful to me is, it seems like you more or less need to have know the context, the greatest context of the Bible, which is reality. So you need to know what is before you even talk about what are the things the Bible specifies. So whether that is, that God is, or that boats are, or that humans walk, or that Jerusalem's on a mount, or on an elevation
What a tree
rather,
and a thorn is.
or what?
What a tree and a thorn is.
What a tree and a thorn is.
Yeah.
You see to know
Even read
stuff.
James Jordan's, uber biblical, trees and thorns. You have to know
Oh yeah,
trees and
sure.
thorns are. Uh,
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I mean, it goes back and forth, but to a degree, like you have to bring the ability to read, the ability to discern grammar, the ability to discern syntax, the ability to know what words are, or the realities that words point to in the Bible. All of that you have to actually bring to the text, and it's no different than anything else. So I think that we have to kind of be a bit more honest with how we're reading the Bible. The greatest context is reality. So the closer we can name reality, the clearer we can understand the Bible.
yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly right. And just two comments. One, when I was speaking of post exegetical, I think I was speaking more normatively than descriptively. You are correct. We kind of bring all these things pre exegetically to the text. And what I was thinking in using the phrase post exegetical is, I think, in a way, we need to recognize that a lot of the questions that we are asking theologically, the text to answer, are not questions that originally arose from the text itself. Even, if you want to even make this, intense, it's like even the difference between exactly how we speak about, the Trinity and the deity of Christ in the New Testament versus how it develops into the grammar of Nicaea. You really can tell the story of the continuity of those grammars but the precise way we're asking the question by the time we get to Nicaea is it's just different than what's exactly the way it's being asked in the mind of the apostles. And similarly with a lot of these kind of Calvinist Arminian disputes, Paul is not debating Calvinism and Arminianism when he's talking about election. Now that doesn't mean what he says about election doesn't have anything to say to that.
Right.
But I think so much of exegesis has to kind of say what's just going on in Paul. So I remember I asked this at ETS this year. I walked around and asked, I think several. I asked Fred Sanders, who's a Wesleyan, right, and somebody else who was a Calvinist theologian. I was like, do you know of any just good Bible book on election? Like, not trying to solve the Calvinist Arminian dispute, but like just takes everything the Bible says about the chosenness of Israel and David and this, that, and the other, and New Testament, and it just tries to like do a biblical theology of all the little layers of election. And actually, there's not an obvious one. It's one of those topics that's been so inflected through dispute that the voice of Scripture, and there's exceptions to that. But
Right.
the other thing, an obvious one. It's one of. Oh, sorry. I think I was hearing.
Sorry, that was me. I was looking our live stream.
Oh no! You're totally fine. No, I think. No, I'll pause there. I think that's all I was going to say.
No, I think that's right. I think. Let me see. There's another sentence we can read, but I think we could maybe finish here for this one. Mechanistic, explanatory work. Well, the one phrase is that one of the interesting things about scientific method is that there's no room left for a rival set of causes, or like a population of interfering demons who evidently have no physical existence, and
No
so on. So
cause.
yeah, it's kind of interesting where like if physical science and its methods define the verifiability of truth, then they limit the amount of causes that are explanatory. So if you have a crisis, it's going to be a biochemical crisis. If it's like a psychological crisis, we don't have a category if we're saying, well, maybe you're being tempted, or maybe there is some sort of demonic thing happening.
Yeah.
And there's a spiritual. Now, it could be a biological one. Don't mishear me. I'm not saying it's either or. But I'm saying there's no category to first say, I wonder if this is a spiritual crisis.
Yeah.
Or is this a biological? I mean, I know it's both and to a degree. Don't mishear me.
But where's the osteometry?
How do they? It's usually just biological. So where I want to say there's going to be a connection of both. There actually could be if someone has by habit created a kind of mind that is, let's say, despairing. Probably that means they lack hope. And through habit and practice, they may have embraced despair for so long that they could be melancholy, we might say.
Yeah.
So do you need drugs for that? Well, drugs might make you feel better, but it may not be that your melancholiness is tied merely to a biological mechanism.
Right.
But, well, it is biological because through the habits you've actually made yourself feel this way.
Right.
But actually the original cause might be a lack of hope. And so by reintroduction of hope and through the habit of hopefulness, you might move from melancholy through despair to hope.
Yeah, and this is where Lepine's book that I know you're aware of, The Logic of the Body, who I think is still the best current writer on this, but he makes the point in that book that this is one of the reasons it's so helpful that the Bible speaks about growth in such organic metaphors. The fruit. You don't just like go from not hope to hope, but there's this process of habit formation that you just described, that you're cultivating hope, and it's like fruit bearing over a long period of time that you bear these distinctive kinds of fruits. Last thing I'll say on the phrase science, one of the things that's interesting, and this just dovetails, it's what I was intending to say earlier. Somebody like our colleague Ryan Hurd will talk about the phrase "the science of theology," and of course, this was was this debate for a long time: is theology a science? The medievals have a particular definition of science and say theology as a science, and all as late as Bavinck, you can hear somebody talking about theology as a distinctive kind of science, but in a lot of ways, it was a science very much like what Wyatt just described, which is a science of reality, taking the grammar of reality which the grammar of Scripture is overlaying upon, and then understanding how that relationship enables me to name God in the mind, and even to have some sense of the layeredness of those names. So when you go to our colleague Hurd's classes, one of the things he's wanting to teach us in very much what Wyatt just said, which is get reality very well. And then when I go to the scriptures and it says all these names of God, what I'm able to do is say, how is it using that name of God versus this name? And sometimes we can tell very automatically by instinct. Like, again, we always say to the 6-year-old girl, you can say, when the Bible says God is love or God is a rock, which one is kind of more filling out the God thing? And they're all going to say, well,
Right.
God is love. The rock thing, we kind of know what it means, but there's trickier ones. That's the basic thing
Right.
that's always going on in the science of theology. There's trickier ones, and what the science of theology, in a sense, is trying to do is to take the God structures in the world, have them inform the movements of our mind in the way that He's revealed Himself. And what we're actually doing a science of, and doing a science of theology, in some sense, is a science of creation, a science of the creation in which God has revealed Himself. And as we unhook certain creaturely realities in our mind, God can fill that out. Nevertheless, what we never land in through philosophical gazing is the beatific vision, right? We don't like contain God. It's more like a science of unhooking us from from creaturely reality, so that we can approximate, so that we can get close, in a sense. We can know that of God, but have a sense of what He is beyond the veil, a veil that He will reach into our world and pull us into, such that we will have a knowledge of Him that doesn't require
Hmm.
discourse we're dependent on.
Well, you mentioned it's a doctrine of creation. There's one connected thing that might be helpful to finish on, just to clarify a piece that we were talking about earlier. It's part of this is a confidence that God created us so we can know things. We're created in His
Yeah,
image, and there's a moral law written on our heart. So when I say that
yeah,
reality is the context of the Bible, I'm not saying it's divorced from God. I'm saying we can
right.
know reality because God made us to know reality.
Yep,
So if someone says it's loving for me to throw a brick at your face, every every rational person knows that that is incorrect.
right.
So you can know that it might be loving to help someone pick up their books that they dropped or whatever. And everyone knows, all things being equal, that is maybe a loving action to do because you're acting towards someone else's good. So I think this is like an important thing when you're talking about just knowing what reality is. It's because God made us that way. It's a trust in what the Bible says about being created in God's image, about knowing that the sun is, that the moon are, the moon is, the stars are. It's why when we twist that knowledge, that it's possible to worship the sun, moon, and stars because you know that
That's
they are and that they're
right.
from God. The problem is then the faculty of the will, the choice to exchange the glory of God for the creature of God.
Yep.
But you actually know what the creatures are. So I think
Yeah.
that's just an important distinction to make as
And
we kind of wind down.
yeah, maybe I will cheat and add one last little line.
That I'm
Um,
going to add one too. No.
Yeah, but I don't remember. I don't remember if I've mentioned Barfield on this podcast before. I talk about Barfield a good bit in class and such. But one of the things he does that I think is really helpful on this score is that idols in the ancient world, idols tended to take on material form. There was something about their orientation to the world such that when they made an idol, it was going to be a statue. And you see this in pagan cultures. In in Christian cultures and in post medieval cultures, Barfield argues, our idols are going to take the form of an ideology. That is to say, when we have a scaffolding in our head, a kind of engineer spreadsheet about what reality is, and then we say God is that. So I've read all my Bible verses, and now I know who God is, and God actually becomes, and there's the word we used earlier, reduced to the kind of understanding I have in my mind. Whereas what the fathers and what scriptures are trying to do is not say, here is God sort of contained in something. It's actually trying to, the whole point of scripture's way of posturing you toward God is to posture you toward Him in a way that avoids idolatry. It's removing every hindrance so that
All, yeah.
what God is left, in a sense, uncontained. Not He's genuinely revealed Himself, but he's never comprehended it. It's a temptation, especially I think in among kind of reform types who, because we love our theology and we love our books, to kind of how it's easy to, there's a lot of personalities maybe that have a sense of like, I have the theology system in my head. And that is not dissimilar than knowing as much about God and being related to God properly as much as one could possibly be, which is an idol. Yeah, that's not very different than being related to God by means of an idol.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think so. I say we stop here and we'll come back next week for whatever the next talk will be.
All right. Sounds good.
Stopping. There we go.